off of exporting through the east. What I would suggest for the government, instead of subsidizing LNG through Churchill, probably at a loss, is to create conditions.
The world is entering a new phase of trade wars. Before our very eyes, familiar patterns and alliances that seemed unshakable for decades are crumbling. At the center of this storm is the confrontation between Canada and the United States, where Donald Trump has attempted to make his northern neighbor dependent on American terms. However, instead of complying, Canada has made an unexpected move. It has begun to build new trade corridors that are changing the rules of the game.
So there's a matter of, is it competitive with Gulf of Mexico? How could we make it competitive with Gulf of Mexico? There were proponents that brought forward projects. There were projects that were rejected, brought by the private sector to the government, that were rejected by the government. In fact,
the main focus is energy. For many years, Canada was the largest supplier of oil and gas to the US. But now, thanks to the expansion of pipelines and the construction of new terminals, Canadian resources are going to Europe and Asia. Billions of dollars have been invested in infrastructure that allows oil, liquefied natural gas, and critical minerals to be shipped to places where demand is stable and politicians do not use energy as a weapon. This is not a defensive measure, but an offensive strategy.
I mean, they have expressed more openness, absolutely, in the last 6 months in public. They've expressed more openness of getting, frankly, the gas that's exported from the West, already going to Quebec and extending some pipelines. The Premier of New Brunswick has a pretty good proposal lined up to do such a thing, to extend a pipeline from Quebec.
The port of Churchill in Manitoba has become a symbol of change. Once seemingly forgotten and abandoned, it is now becoming Canada's northern gauges or to Europe. It will not only handle shipments of liquefied gas, but also strategic minerals that are essential to the new energy, electronics, and defense industries. The decision to develop such a route demonstrates that Canada is ready to build a global trade network, even if it means literally paving the way through the Arctic.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
These steps are increasing tensions in relations with Washington. Donald Trump continues to apply pressure with tariffs. There are 35% and sometimes even 50% tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and other goods. But unlike Europe, which made concessions for the sake of predictability, Ottawa has chosen strategic patience. No quick deals or questionable concessions. Only a long-term bet on new markets, on strengthening national industry, and on internal support for the sectors that have been hit hardest. Meanwhile, the consequences of the tariff war are beginning to be felt in the US. The auto industry, retail, even giants like Apple and General Motors all are recording billions in losses. Consumers are seeing price increases for everyday goods, from shoes to coffee. Economists warn that if tariffs remain in place, real incomes of American families will decline and manufacturing will continue to lose jobs.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Against this backdrop, Canada is gradually strengthening its influence. In Asia, Japanese and Korean companies are increasingly interested in new supply routes. In Europe, they are looking for stable partners who are not affected by sudden tariff hikes. Canada is transforming from a junior ally of the US into a competitor capable of winning contracts and changing the balance of power in the global energy market. Trump is betting on pressure and threats. The Canadian leadership is betting on endurance and strategic positioning. The outcome of this struggle is not yet clear. But one thing is obvious: North America is entering a period when its two closest neighbors are becoming rivals. And right now, it is being decided who will dictate the rules of world trade in the coming years: Washington, with its blackmail tactics, or Ottawa, with its quiet but persistent building of new bridges.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
For decades, Canada has been perceived by the world as a country closely tied to the United States in terms of economics and trade. Nearly 3/4 of Canadian exports went there, and the entire energy infrastructure was oriented toward the south. But in recent years, this equation has begun to change rapidly. The reason for this was the growing tension with Washington and Donald Trump's tariff policy, which hit steel, aluminum, wood, and even agricultural product. When many expected a passive response and concessions, Ottawa made the opposite choice. It began to actively rebuild its trade architecture. Mark Carney's European tour became a symbol of the new line. Canada not only no longer intends to depend on a single partner, but also intends to build a network of trade relations that will span several continents at once. In Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, the Canadian delegation presented a diversification strategy based on three key areas: energy infrastructure and critical minerals. Europe, faced with supply instability and rising energy prices, listened carefully to every word. Behind the scenes, European officials acknowledged that after many years of dependence on a single source, whether Russia or the US, the emergence of another major supplier could be a lifeline. In Canada itself, this was presented as an offensive rather than a defensive move. Indeed, for the first time in decades, the Canadian economy stopped thinking in terms of how to keep up with the US and began planning how to occupy space on the global stage.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
At the same time, the focus was not only on traditional oil and gas. The Canadian government presented calculations showing that within 5 years, the country could capture up to 12% of the global market for lithium, nickel, and cobalt minerals that are critical for electric vehicles and high technology. These figures, based partly on official forecasts and partly on optimistic estimates in the presentation, were impressive. Europe has long been looking for an alternative to Asian suppliers, and Canada looked like a partner that could offer not only raw materials but also political stability. The signals were clear. Unlike temporary agreements with the US, which can be changed with a single tweet from Donald Trump, Canada's strategy is designed to last for decades. It is also important that diversification was presented not as a forced step due to pressure, but as a conscious decision to strengthen independence. This allowed Canadian diplomats to talk to Europeans on equal terms, rather than from the position of a victim of a tariff war. Even the choice of cities that Carney visited seemed symbolic. He began his meetings not in Washington, but in European capitals, showing that the old order no longer determines Canadian foreign economic policy.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
But energy became a much more compelling argument. In recent years, Canada has completed one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in its history, the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, costing more than $34 billion. Just a few years ago, critics claimed that this project would be a burden, but today it is becoming an instrument of geopolitical restructuring. While at the beginning of the project, oil supplies were divided roughly equally between the US and Asian countries, by mid-2025, almost 60% of Canadian oil was going to the east, and the US share had fallen to 40%. Within the country, this was called the Pacific Pivot.
Second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. And thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
Technical details also matter. At the Westridge terminal, where tankers are loaded with oil, depth restrictions remain in place, which means that ships leave only 70 to 80% full. But the government plans to carry out large-scale dredging, which will allow them to be loaded completely and reduce transportation costs by 15 to 20%. These percentages may seem insignificant, but on the global market, they determine who will win the contract and who will lose billion-dollar deals.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States...
It is precisely this that adds tension to the discussions, showing that Canada can use the North not only as a trade corridor, but also as an instrument of geopolitical influence. Another project is unfolding alongside this one, LNG Canada in Kitimat. A terminal is being built there to supply liquefied gas to Japan and South Korea. Combined with the expansion of Trans Mountain, capable of competing on equal terms with both the US and other energy powers. By gradually building new routes and strengthening its position in Europe and Asia, Canada has found itself at a cell where its interests intersect with those of the United States, making confrontation inevitable. When the country ceased to be exclusively a supplier to the South, it automatically became a competitor to Washington in global energy markets. This is precisely the essence of the third and fourth points of the plan, transforming Canada from a junior partner into a rival of the US and a parallel struggle on the diplomatic front, where Donald Trump continues to apply pressure with tariffs, but encounters unexpected resistance in the form of Canada's tactic of patience and waiting.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
First, it is important to understand that competition here is based not only on export figures, but also on symbolism. When Canada signs new agreements with European companies for the supply of gas and oil, it is not about tens of millions of barrels, but about destroying the perception that Washington controls the West's energy map. Officials in Brussels admit that for the first time in decades, they are negotiating hydrocarbon supplies with someone other than the US and the Middle East. These agreements are not yet large-scale, but they show that European factories and energy companies are considering Canada as a serious alternative. The situation is even more evident in Asia. South Korea and Japan, under constant pressure from Washington, have begun to sign long-term memoranda of understanding with Canadian suppliers. According to official data, we are talking about billions of dollars and 10-year contracts. But much more ambitious plans are being discussed behind the scenes. Up to 20% of South Korea's liquefied gas needs by 2032 will be met by Canadian resources. Even if these are only forecasts for now, they are being taken seriously.
Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship,
technical details add extra weight to everything that is happening. Canadian terminals are being modernized, which will speed up loading, increase the depth of berths, and allow for the use of maximum-class tankers. All this reduces costs and makes Canadian raw materials competitive not only in Europe but also in Asia, where transportation costs are a major factor. One analyst report contained an interesting calculation. If the modernization projects are completed on time, Canada will be able to supply oil and gas to Japan more cheaply than the US, despite the greater distance. This came as a shock to Washington. After all, Donald Trump's entire strategy was based on the idea that tariff pressure would force Ottawa to give in and maintain its previous dependence. But the result was the opposite. Canada is using every move by the US as an excuse to accelerate its own diversification. American television channels are increasingly showing stories about contracts that were considered a done deal for American companies unexpectedly going to competitors. This happened, for example, with a major tender in Poland, where American gas supplies were expected, but in the end, the contract was divided between Qatar and Canada.
in fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
It is at this point that competition escalates into diplomatic confrontation. Donald Trump is accustomed to acting quickly and decisively, announcing tariffs, creating pressure, and forcing partners to make concessions. This was the case with Europe, where Washington achieved a 15% tariff ceiling and multi-billion-dollar commitments to purchase American goods. But in the case of Canada, the scheme did not work. When the deadline for the trade deal passed, Ottawa not only refused to make concessions, but also began to strengthen ties with other partners. Negotiations between Washington and Ottawa turned into a chess game. The United States imposes new tariffs, and Canada responds not symmetrically, but selectively, choosing the sectors that are most sectored to American politics. In March, an additional tariff was imposed on a number of consumer goods from the US, including popular beverages and household appliances, which sparked protests not only from companies but also from voters in key states. At the same time, Canada demonstratively refrained from taking too drastic steps, so as not to give Trump a reason to accuse it of aggression. Interestingly, this strategy is beginning to bear fruit. American manufacturers have begun to openly complain about the loss of competitive advantages. In the automotive industry, for example, there is growing concern that Canadian supplies of components via new routes to Europe and Asia are reducing these regions' dependence on American factories. According to one research center, the US could lose up to 7% of the global ascent of the global market within 5 years if the trend continues.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
Another dimension of the conflict is political. Donald Trump is using trade policy as a tool in his domestic campaign, demonstrating toughness and a willingness to protect America. But for Canada, this creates an opportunity to play the long game. While the US is betting on quick results, Ottawa is playing a game of attrition, strengthening domestic industries, expanding its network of alliances, and creating the impression of a reliable partner. Analysts note that for businesses in Europe and Asia, predictability is becoming the main argument in favor of Canada. Some fictional but telling details make the picture even more tense. Rumors circulated in the Canadian media that several large American corporations had directly asked the White House to soften tariffs on trade with Canada, as the new duties undermine their own supply chains. These statements were not officially confirmed, but their discussion in the Canadian Parliament added weight to the government's position. Even within the US,